Hello, everybody. We are going ahead and doing our next president's video today. I know I discussed about possibly doing one on the election of 1800, and what was the other issue here that I thought about? Oh, yeah, the South Carolina secession. However, after careful consideration, I deemed that the South Carolina secession would be better placed since it's not really. It was more just a symbolic, simple act more than a controversial. Well, it was controversial, but more than a sophisticated, complicated issue. It was something that just kind of came about and would be better suited when we talk about Abraham Lincoln when that occurs. Actually, James Buchanan, because it occurred during his presidency. But anyway, and the election of 1800, there wasn't a whole lot of sources that could give me a whole lot of separate information on the issue. And so we just kind of squeezed it in to combine it here with our next president's video, since this was the president that was actually affected by that election, and it is the reason we now have the 12th Amendment, which officially changed the election rules and changed that we must have a separate vote for president and vice president. They are no longer whoever gets the most is president, and whoever gets second most in an election is going to be president. They switched the rules. That way we would never have to come to that kind of a situation again. So today we're moving on. We're going to go ahead here today and do our third president. And if you don't know who that is, I'm quite shocked if you don't. It's probably our other famous one. It's probably, in fact, I would say if most people know some of their presidents, they should at least know their first three. At least know your first three. Those are pretty famous guys from the Revolution. Even the fourth to away, but not everyone really knows the fourth, and thus I would forgive you for not knowing it. So today, if you haven't guessed who our third president was, it's none other than this very famous guy. And yes, we're using the flashcard heads. That way I just got something I can flip out and show a photo. Portrait, painting, I don't care what you want to call it. We've got every president in here up to, let me look, up to George W. Bush. So when we get to Trump and Obama, we'll have to go ahead and do all that. But that's like way off. That's way out in the future. So today, in case you have not guessed, it is none other than our third president of the United States was none other than another one of our founding fathers. It was none other than Thomas Jefferson, who, of course, if you have had any history class at all, you probably at least remember him on July 4th for being the author of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was actually probably one of our most influential presidents in terms of he kind of took away, as we discussed with the Adams and Washington administrations, it was somewhat aristocratic. And when aristocratic, I mean the Federalists had taken power. The Federalists believed in a strong interpretation of the Constitution, that the government needed to be strong and centralized in order for the country to run properly, that the government needed to be intervened in almost everything. And this also led to aristocracy of some parts, where government officials kind of held themselves in their own self-created wealthy world where they were above others. And even the president, to a certain degree, had customs and practices that weren't exactly democratic in nature or seemed like they fit in a freedom-loving society, such as the use of when you greeted the president, you had to bow to him like you would a king, or the use that the president would always wear a wig like a wealthy person, big old powdered wig. I don't know if you can hear the phone, but the phone is ringing. We are not answering that phone. Anyway, as we go through here, Thomas Jefferson was definitely, he bashed some of these presidential decisions, and we're going to explain that here shortly. So let's first, before we do, there's my handy-dandy little notebook here. Before we do, let's go over Jefferson's background before he was president. Of course, most of us probably know some of his background, given the factor that he was such an influential founding father. So we're going to go all the way back. 1743. Yes, we're going way back, before the United States was even a country. Thomas Jefferson was born that year, and on April 13th. He was born at the plantation of Shadwell, which was owned by his parents, whose parents' names were Peter and Jane, and he was born on this plantation of Shadwell, which is near what is now Charlottesville, Virginia. He was born in Virginia like George Washington was. His parents were also very wealthy slave owners as well, and we're going to talk about this just a little bit later on. But slavery, as you probably all have probably heard at some point in your life, Thomas Jefferson supposedly had children, and I think it has actually been proven he did. He did have some children with a slave of his before he died. And for years it was a controversy, and now after genetic tests and everything else, there are actual African-American people today that can trace their lineage back to Jefferson, because he literally had children with this one slave of his, Sally Hemings. Now, as we all know, slavery was a bad institution. I shouldn't even say bad, it was an institution. It was an evil institution, would be the proper word. Evil and unjust, and even to a way satanic. Not literally that they were practicing devil worshipping, but derive the factor that it was an evil institution. It should never have been done. Now, we also know that Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence, and you might ask yourself the question, well, how could a man that proclaims that each and every person is created equally under God have slaves? Well, believe me, Jefferson was not dull about this issue. He was not in the blind. He wasn't one of these people that proclaimed liberty and freedom, but yet he had slaves of his own and just kind of ignored the factor. Jefferson very much knew this. He did realize this in his own consciousness during his life, and it very much took a toll on him, as he did try to argue with himself over how he was properly in any way practicing the principles that he preached when he himself had slaves on his own. Jefferson had slaves, but it wasn't because he wanted them. It was because he deemed it was somewhat of a necessity for him to even live at that time, for most people to live at that time. In Jefferson's case, it was a necessity as he viewed it, but it was not a necessity that he viewed very positively. He actually did view slavery very negatively, and he very much knew it was going to be a problem to come down the road that would tear the Union apart if it was not taken care of, which of course we will see eventually will. But anyway, let's get back here. Thomas Jefferson was born in 1743 to his parents of Peter and Jane Jefferson in their plantation of Shadwell, Virginia. He was the third out of 8 children. He had, however, only a couple of these children survived. He was the eldest son. He had one brother that lived up to adulthood and 6 sisters. Thomas's father died in 1757, which caused his relationship with his mother to kind of sour a little bit, because his mother automatically assumed that since Thomas was the eldest son, he was rightfully now the new owner of the plantation, and he should be taking up his father's duties as a plantation farmhand, as a farmer. Well, Thomas had no interest in this kind of life. He very much did not have any interest in running a plantation. So he very much come to strain with his mother. He didn't want to really take up the responsibility that she automatically assumed that he would assume from his father. So instead, in 1757, starting through 1760, Jefferson actually boards with his schoolmaster. Jefferson actually takes a great love into education. He's very much the educator enthusiast. Most people just go to school. Well, Jefferson did not just go to school. He literally lived with his schoolmaster for a couple of years. And this was done so he could try to further his subjects that he liked to learn. He loved to learn arithmetic. He loved to write. He loved English. He learned how to speak Latin and Greek. He was fluent in both, plus English. This was a multilingual president. And a fun factor, later in his life, Jefferson learned other languages. He became very fluent in French. He became very fluent in Spanish. And he even knew a little bit of Native American. He was probably our most multilingual president that we've ever had. He knew more languages than most people. He was probably also, to put this mildly, he was probably our most educated president. And he took his education very seriously. In 1760, Jefferson leaves from his schoolmaster, and he just enters at the age of 18. Hold on. I gotta think how old he would be here. 1743, I'd say he was about 17 years old. At the age of 17, he is admitted into the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, which was the capital of Virginia during the colonial days. Jefferson was a very obsessive student when he was in college. He was constantly spending about 15 hours a day studying, reading his books. I don't know about you, but I don't spend 15 hours a day studying. And then if that was not enough, after he would be done studying every day, and this was on a daily schedule, he would do this daily. He would study for 15 hours, and then for another 3 hours, he would practice his violin. Well, he was very fluent in music. He loved to play his violin, and he would constantly practice for 3 hours a day on the violin after he had spent 15 hours studying, and then whatever time he had left, he would eat and sleep. This was an obsessive student. He was obsessed with education. Jefferson completed his term at William and Mary, kind of got interested in the law a little bit, and he got his bar in 1767 and became a small-town lawyer. Of course, he didn't really preside over any major cases. It was just simply like lawsuit disputes and stuff like that. Nothing major, not like John Adams later would do. In 1768, Jefferson built his own home. And when I say he built his own home, I don't mean he just simply had someone draw up plans and built, and then he paid him to build it. Oh no, Jefferson designed his own home. Every architectural detail was his idea, his creation, and he put it on paper, told some people, you're going to build this, and then he had his slaves do it. He did inherit slaves from his dad. He did not buy them, they were inherited. In 1768, Jefferson, of course, he starts building this, and he builds his home on a mountain near his family home of Shadwell. He builds this on a small mountain overlooking where Shadwell is, and he names his new home Monticello, which, if you do not know what Monticello is, all you need to simply do is nickel. Of course, most of you probably know that Thomas Jefferson is on our nickel. He's right here. I don't know if you can really see the detail, but if you don't, pull out your own nickel. I'm sure you got one in your house. But right here he is on the nickel, and if you go to the reverse side, and it's got this building, that is, you'll notice it says Monticello. That is a little engraving of Jefferson's home that he designed himself. He was a very fluent architect. Now, Jefferson would continuously improve upon Monticello throughout the rest of his life. In fact, he actually kept over 5,000 records of the building and construction of his home, including everything from weather reports to the daily goings-on to how the gardens were planted to architectural remodels that he wanted to do and little updates that he wanted to get done. He constantly would make little daily records of what went on at his home. In 1768 was also an important year for Jefferson because it was also the year that he really started gaining a political career. And this was the year that he ran for the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was the Virginia colonial legislature in the colonial days. And Jefferson was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses. He did win the election, and he went ahead and entered in 1769, and he served there until 1775, until the outbreak of the American Revolution. Now, Jefferson became very known in the House of Burgesses for his calm and reserved manner, but he also became known that he was a very great writer, because during his time, he was probably one of the earliest critics of British rule in North America following the French and Indian War. And during his time in the Virginia House of Burgesses, he actually wrote a couple of notable pamphlets. And in 1774, he wrote his pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America. And this was really the first pamphlet that anyone had printed in the colonies that suggested that Britain had no right to exercise any authority over the American colonies. Jefferson was almost from his earliest career in politics, he was very much an American patriot. He was very much anti-British. On January 1st of 1772, during his time in the Virginia House of Burgesses, Jefferson married his wife. He married a young widow by the name of Martha Wales Skelton, and they would end up having 6 children together. Unfortunately, only 2 of these children, their 2 daughters, Martha and Mary, would be the only ones to actually live and make it to adulthood. The rest of them didn't make it through childhood, or some of them died when they were infants. And very sadly for Thomas, Martha would later die in 1782 after only 10 years of marriage due to complications that she suffered after childbirth, and Jefferson never remarried after her death. Throughout until his death himself, he actually, on his neck, carried a little golden necklace that had a locket on it, and if you opened the locket, it had a strand of his wife's hair. He kept that with him ever since she had died. In 1775, Jefferson was selected as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and he was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence a year later in 1776 when that occurred. As we all know, Jefferson kind of was very much, I think if you know Jefferson for anything, it was the Declaration of Independence that you know him most for. He was the primary author of that, although there were revisions by the Continental Congress after he had officially presented his draft of it to them. He was still the primary author, especially of the preamble, which of course has the little fragment that we all probably remember, that all men have a natural born right endowed by, that it was given to them by God. They have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson was the primary author of this, and it's quite amazing if you really think about it, because this guy would have only been, let me think here, if he was born in 1743, this guy would have only been about 33 years old when he wrote this. He was quite young. And he was actually, when he joined the Continental Congress, he became good friends with John Adams. This was really his first meeting with John Adams, and they became very good friends. He also became good friends with Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who was also there. And it was actually Adams who recognized pretty early on that Thomas Jefferson had a unique writing ability. And when the time came that they proposed that someone needed to draft an official Declaration of Independence, it was John Adams who actually suggested that Thomas Jefferson write it for his writing skills. He believed that Jefferson could very well write a fluent piece of document that could explain the colonists' grievances against the crown. And Thomas did not disappoint. He wrote a very compelling document in which he listed the grievances the colonists had against the king, why they were separating from him, and it endowed that each individual had these individual personal rights that were given to them. It also stated in his document that all men were created equal, which was kind of a new concept at that time, since there was still a lot of slavery going on in the United States. And then even if you weren't a slave, you weren't always treated as equal if you were of a different race. And that concept would also stick with Jefferson the rest of his life, because he would constantly be having this personal battle with it over the factor that I do believe in this, but in life I'm not always practicing it because I have slaves. From 1777 to 1779, Jefferson returned to the House of Burgesses. He left the Continental Congress, and he then went and served as the governor of Virginia from 1779 to 1781, toward the end of the war. Jefferson was also the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and this was eventually passed by the Virginia legislature in 1786. And what this basically was of importance was, until that time, most governments had some association with the church. They let some religious laws kind of govern the land. And Jefferson did not, in his own view, he thought that this was wrong. He was a believer in God, but he was not exactly a Christian. Jefferson was, I think, what they would call him, a deist. He believed in God, but not the way that most Christians do. And it's kind of a complicated subject. So maybe I'll have a separate video on it, but he was not exactly a normal Christian. Let's put it like that. And he believed that religion was important, but in Jefferson's view, he viewed that religion really had no place in government. He didn't believe that that was right. He believed that everyone had a right of religious freedom, that they should be free to practice whatever religion that they preferred. Be it Jew, be they were Jew, be it they were Muslim, be it they were Christian, be it Buddhist, whatever. They should be able to freely practice their religion and not have to worry about being persecuted for it. Or even the different Christian denominations would even count too, because like you have Catholics, you have Protestants. There's antagonism between the two groups. But Jefferson believed that the government was no place for religion, and that government should be religion-free. That there should be a separation, as he called it, of church and state. The state is the government, the church is the religion. They should be separate, not combined or conjoined in any way, but they should be kept apart. And Jefferson's statute for religious freedom was really the first time that someone expressed this idea anywhere in the world, really. And for Virginia to later actually adopt it, they became the first state to actually have this in place, and later on it was the very statute for religious freedom that Thomas Jefferson had authored that later became a primary source for the very first amendment to the Constitution that literally states that you have freedom of religion. It was a very compelling and influencing part for that amendment to be created. Jefferson returned to Congress in 1783, and he eventually, at the very end of the war, after he had served as governor. This was 2 years after he had served as governor. And immediately upon that, he serves in Congress for a while, and then just 2 years later, he agrees to serve and replace Benjamin Franklin as the U.S. minister to France. And this was where France really changed Jefferson a lot. He really deepened his belief in liberty as he was in France until 1789. He got to see the very start of the French Revolution, and he was very much what would be the word here, disgusted with how the French monarchy had kind of treated the downtrodden, the peasants in that country. He very much sympathized with the French revolutionaries at the first. And it also influenced him in terms of architecture and also in terms of economics. Jefferson became intrigued with the dome structure that he commonly would see in Europe, especially in France. And when he returned home in 1789, he made sure that he redesigned Monticello and made it the first building in the United States to have a dome on it. It was the very first. He made sure that he wanted a dome, and he changed all kinds of architecture on his home in response to what he had seen in France. He really built his architectural taste. He wanted European influence on it that was not British, but from other European nations that he had been to. In terms of economics, Jefferson's political economic belief also changed with going to France, where he learned the term of laissez-faire. And laissez-faire simply kind of translates to hands off. And what this means in Jefferson's own eye is that the government, laissez-faire is an economic policy which states that the government should intervene in the economy as little as possible, that it should largely remain alone and be free to operate on its own structure, on its own will, without the government regulating really anything. Jefferson was a very big proponent of laissez-faire economics. He was very much for this. He very much stood for decreased government regulation, for very much the federal government shouldn't be all controlling. It should be limited in its power. Well, this would later also found his political belief that a strong central government was a danger to democracy and that this was not needed for the future of the United States. When Jefferson returned home in 1789, he came home and he didn't really have time to sit home because George Washington had just been elected president earlier in the spring of that year, and he asked Jefferson upon returning, will you serve as my Secretary of State? He wanted him to be his main foreign policy advisor. And Jefferson readily accepted this because he had experience with the European nations, and he deemed, sure, I'll serve as your Secretary of State, no problem. So he comes and he becomes the very first Secretary of State the United States ever has. However, he becomes isolated in Washington's cabinet because he is constantly at odds with two figures. John Adams was one, as by this point the Federalist Party is starting to gain premise, they're starting to form, and they believe that the federal government should have more power than what the Constitution directly delegates. Where Jefferson is a very big proponent of whatever the Constitution does not delegate, specifically state, is a power of the federal government, should automatically be reserved for the states. That the federal government should be limited in its power, while the Federalists are very much for expanding powerful central government in order to kind of regulate and control things. Well, this puts him at odds with John Adams, who kind of comes into line and he takes the Federalist side. But the person that he most gets in an argument with is none other than the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who, if you don't know who that is, I'm sure you've seen or heard about the Broadway little musical, whatever it is, Hamilton. And if you don't know who that is still, just take out a $10 bill, and you'll know who that is. Hamilton was the head of the Federalist Party, and his policies commonly gained favor of Washington. Washington claimed he was politically neutral, that he discouraged the formation of political parties, but in most often cases, Washington more often sided with Hamilton and the Federalists than he would with Jefferson. Jefferson was outraged by Hamilton's policies, by Hamilton's insistence. Like, for one of their earliest clashes was the creation of a national bank, which Jefferson thought was unconstitutional, that this would put the government in control of most people's money, that this was not right, that people should be able to place their money in state banks, that that the federal government shouldn't have direct control over individuals' money. And this was very contrary to what Hamilton believed. Hamilton believed that the United States needed to be ready to assume certain people's debt. They needed to be ready to assume control of finances in order to look credible to other countries for taking a loan or something like that, to build credibility. And Jefferson was very much against him on this. Eventually, the National Bank did get created, and Hamilton won that argument. But Jefferson was very much a counter in the Washington administration. Him and Hamilton constantly would come to blows, and eventually Jefferson got so fed up with the Federalist policies that he went ahead and was a founding member of the Democratic Republican Party, which their modern descendants today are the Democrats. So the Democrats of today, who just won a presidential election, They can trace their lineage all the way back to Thomas Jefferson in the 1790s. The Democratic Republican Party is very much it very much mirrors Jefferson's personal beliefs. He believes that the government should be limited in its power and that large amounts of the power should be left to the states if it's not explicitly said to belong to the federal government in the Constitution. And he also believes in the laissez-faire economics program where the government should have very little intervention, if any, possible. In 1796, Jefferson ran for president. He had resigned from Washington's cabinet in about 1794. He decided that he was not going to continue in Washington's cabinet anymore, so he just constantly came to blows with Hamilton. He did depart peacefully, though, with Washington on good terms. He did not depart on a sad, negative term with Washington. They had a good relationship at his departure, and he left upon his own choice. In 1796, Jefferson decides that he's going to run for president. And he does this, and his opponent ends up being none other than his old friend turned rival, John Adams, who is the Federalist candidate for president. Thomas Jefferson runs as the Democratic-Republican candidate, or the Republican. Back then, they would just call it Republican, but nowadays we gotta call it Democratic-Republican because the Republican Party today is not related to the Democratic-Republican Party. They're two separate parties away. So anyway, he runs as a Democratic-Republican candidate. Adams runs as the Federalist candidate. Adams ends up winning the election in 1796, but Jefferson gets the second most votes in the election. And so because of this, by constitutional law, he becomes the vice president. Well, this is kind of a bad thing because now you got a president in office of one political party who's got a vice president of the opposite political party. They're supposed to work together, but now they're on different political spectrums, so they're constantly at each other's throats. It doesn't quite work. They're constantly fighting throughout the administration. In 1800, Jefferson decides that he will run again for president. And this time, in the controversial 1800 election, he easily defeats Adams. Adams loses by a landslide. However, Jefferson does have a problem. Although he defeats Adams with the electoral vote count, he becomes into conflict with a member of his fellow party, Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr also runs as a Democratic-Republican candidate, and upon him running, him and Jefferson actually end up tying. Now, you might ask, okay, so what do we do if there's a presidential tie? Well, at this time, I don't know if this is how they do it today. I'll actually have to look that up at some point, I suppose. But at the time, if there was ever a tie in a presidential election, it was up to the House of Representatives to actually vote and try to break that tie, to try to decide who was the winner. And the House of Representatives voted multiple times trying to break the tie, but instead I think there was like 5 votes, and it still was a deadlock. They could not decide who was going to become president. Congress was dominated by the Federalists, mind you, at this point. And there was very much fear that Thomas Jefferson was almost like probably the worst thing that you could possibly do from a switch from a Federalist policy that had been in place since Washington and Adams to a Democratic-Republican policy under Jefferson, where they viewed that Burr, although he was no Jefferson, he was probably just as bad, if not worse. Ultimately, it was actually not John Adams. It was ultimately Thomas Jefferson's old rival, Alexander Hamilton, who ultimately helped break that deadlock by influencing certain House members to vote toward Jefferson, as he viewed that Jefferson would be a much safer bet than Burr would be, which of course would later cost him his life, as just a couple years later, Burr would exit while he was vice president. Since Burr ended up being second, he got to become vice president during Jefferson's first term. He was later replaced by the second term. But anyway, Burr would later challenge Hamilton to a duel, I think about 1804, and he actually shot and killed him, but never got charged for it. So anyway, in the very controversial election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson ultimately comes out as the winner through a House vote. And because of the controversy and chaos that had ensued, Congress kind of decides that we need a new amendment to the Constitution to stop this from ever occurring again. And in 1804, they passed the 12th Amendment, which certifies that no longer will it be first runner-up as president, second runner-up as vice president. It will now be there will be a separate ballot cast for each candidate. That way we don't have this kind of a situation again. The modern presidential system is now in place after 1800. So now we get to Thomas Jefferson's presidency. But before we do, I'll show you the electoral map of the 1800 election. I think we already viewed it once in our last video, but in case you need a review, here you go. Green is states that Jefferson won. The orange is states that Adams won. Adams, about his only strong area was New England, the New England area, because that's where he was from. He was from Massachusetts. Other than that, Adams largely lost by a landslide. So we get to Jefferson's presidency. Jefferson was sworn in on March 4th of 1801 in the new federal capital of Washington, D.C. He was actually the very first president to be inaugurated in the new capital, as George Washington's first term he had been inaugurated in New York, and then in Washington's second term and John Adams's term they had both been inaugurated in Philadelphia. So Jefferson is sworn in on March 4th of 1801. He's sworn in Washington, D.C., and he breaks tradition almost as soon as he goes to the inauguration. Until this point, Washington and Adams had both rode in a horse-drawn carriage to their inauguration, which some viewed was kind of aristocratic. It was kind of like a king or a royal official would in Europe. Jefferson despised this, and instead of riding in a carriage to his inauguration, he insisted that he walk. And guess what? He walked. He walked to the Capitol to his inauguration, like most presidents do today. So he was the first one to really set this modern precedent. Now, John Adams had served, this was the first election that kind of, in light of today, where we got a controversy going on about conceding power, but this was the first election where there was a peaceful transfer of power when it feared that there could not be. But John Adams had no opposition. He accepted the election results, and he went ahead and conceded to Jefferson without problem, and made no effort to try to violently overturn Jefferson's victory or oppose him. So it was already, the only thing that Adams did not do was he did not attend his successor's inauguration. Now, whether this was due to the factor that he just hated Jefferson at that point, or maybe due to the factor that he lived all the way up in Massachusetts and he had to go quite a ways back home, you can debate which one it was. We don't really know for sure, I don't think, but he did not attend Jefferson's inauguration. He was already out of Washington by that point and heading back up to Massachusetts. Now, many Federalists feared Jefferson when he got elected because they feared that he was going to that when he took power, he would undo everything they've done. He would dismantle a central powerful government that they had tried to create, and instead he would tear down any government institutions that they had kind of created, that he would be They did not see how when the president takes the oath of office, the president is supposed to swear to protect and defend and preserve the Constitution of the United States. Well, the Federalists argued, well, how can this guy protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution of the United States when he seems so committed to tearing down the institutions that it creates? This was the Federalists' fear. Now, Jefferson, at his inauguration, he tries to strike a consolatory note. And in his inaugural address, he makes the very famous proclamation that we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists, trying to say we are all, no matter what our political affiliations were 10 years ago, over these past 10 years, let's put that aside, we're all Americans. Jefferson viewed his election as somewhat of a miracle event. He viewed it as a restoration and recovery of the original Revolutionary War values that had occurred, that the American Revolution had been fought for. He viewed that he would have been elected, he could restore those values, the individual rights, like freedom of the press and speech, which the Federalists had kind of somewhat taken away. He could restore those rights. He could restore people's trust in democracy by limiting the federal government's power, which the Federalists had sought to expand. Jefferson immediately began correcting government problems that he saw as wrong. He started decreasing the size of the military. Instead, he tried to go through peace negotiations with hostile powers, such as France and Great Britain. He tried to limit the size of the military. He drove back government intervention in the economy as much as he could. And he also demolished traditions of a president that he viewed were too aristocratic at the same time. As we mentioned, he already insisted that he would walk to his inauguration instead of literally being driven there by a horse-drawn carriage. He also is the first president to do two other things. Jefferson was our very first president to refuse to wear a powdered wig. Yes, by Jefferson, we can finally get rid of the wigs. The big powdered wigs that we see on this dude. And this dude. Oh, hold on. It does George Washington twice. And John Adams. And then if you look at Jefferson, I mean, he's wearing a wig in this photo. Well, this portrait, but he was actually the first one not to wear a wig. Now, his successor, I think, somewhat wore one, but by the 5th president, we're done. Jefferson was really the first president to get rid of the powdered wig tradition, which he viewed as aristocratic and European in nature. He was not a very pro-wig man. Well, his nickel portrait kind of shows it where he didn't wear a wig. I mean, depends on the nickel. If you look at an older one, you see him with a wig, because I think this is an older portrait of him. But if you look at this one, he's not really wearing a wig. He's just got his hair out. Thomas Jefferson, I think he had like reddish-brown hair, if I remember right. Yeah, normally, because before then, you couldn't really tell what a president's hair color was because they wore a powdered wig. It was white all the time. But anyway, Jefferson is the first one to get rid of the powdered wig. He's also the first president to do a very simple gesture. Until this point, whenever someone would greet the president, you would commonly bow to him. This was started under George Washington. Jefferson immediately gets rid of this. Gets rid of this misconceived notion. He did not like the idea of someone bowing because he's like, that is a monarch to the core. And instead, Jefferson insists that instead of bowing to me, I will shake your hand as a people's gesture. And this sticks. Every president since Jefferson up to today, whenever they greet somebody, of course, maybe not right now because of a pandemic, but every president, when they would greet somebody, you don't bow to the president, you shake hands with the president. Which, of course, in some cases, in one guy's case, shaking the guy's hand actually cost him his life, but we'll get to him eventually. It's the 25th. I'm not going to tell you who that is. You can find that on your own. Or else you'll wait. Anyway, we go to Jefferson breaks these traditions. And if I remember right, he also broke one final tradition. And until this point, it was a tradition that if you wanted to meet with the president, you had to schedule an appointment. Now, we have gone back to that, I think. Not just, and I think it's even tougher now. I don't think anybody can just meet with the president. I think anybody can write a letter to him, though. I think you can write a letter or something like that. But today it's kind of reversed. But back then, it was that initially. But Jefferson was the first president to do something that was a little odd, and we really don't do it today. But he broke a tradition nonetheless for quite a few years. And he was the first president to say, you don't got to make an appointment with me to see me. If you got something you want to say to the president, come on into the White House. We'll have a talk. He had no problem with just inviting a perfect stranger into the White House. In 1803, Jefferson did. In 1803, we get two events that happened very early on in Jefferson's term. First, the only state to be admitted during his term, my home state of Ohio, was actually admitted in 1803, which gains Jefferson the 17th state of the Union, and was the first one to be created from the Northwest Territory. But the big event in 1803 that Jefferson largely gets credit for, and this is probably his most significant achievement, was none other than the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, Jefferson successfully negotiated the buying of not only French Louisiana, but of the French port of New Orleans, but he managed to get the French to actually sell their entire Louisiana territory that they had from Napoleon. Napoleon was in power at this point. Jefferson got a steal of a deal. I kid you not. It was that year that Napoleon offered. The United States had offered to buy New Orleans before. They had offered, but however, France was not really all keen to buy it. By 1803, however, the United States makes this offer again because they realize that Napoleon's kind of going on a war footing, and if France is allowed to stay there, it could become a major threat to the United States, and they try to make this offer that we'll buy it from you. Well, Napoleon, at this point in time, in 1803, he's getting ready to go back to war with England, and he really needs some money. He cannot afford to not have the finances to drive a war against Great Britain. So he kind of sees the Americans' offer as an opportunity to gain some money. But he does it fairly. I'll give him this. Plus, the French, although they owned Louisiana, they didn't really control it. I mean, they technically owned the territory, but they really didn't have all that many troops or people out there, other than New Orleans itself. The rest of it was mostly just wild lands run by the Native Americans. The French really had no authority in that land, and thus they really didn't own it. And it was Napoleon also worried that if they go to war with England, England would come down in its colonial possession from Canada, and they would just take it. So he deemed that giving it to the United States would probably be the best option, as he could gain some money and also give the territory to a power that wasn't going to later turn out to be his enemy, hopefully. So he agrees to the offer. He proposes that he'll sell New Orleans to the Americans for $10 million. But he says, oh wait, there's more. If you give me an additional $5 million, I'll give you not just New Orleans, I'll give you just an additional $5 million, I'll sell you the entire territory. So in total, you're only paying $15 million for about 800,000 square miles of land. We're talking literally, in today's money, Jefferson was only paying a couple pennies for an acre. If we could sell land like that today, I'm pretty sure most of us would be landlords. Rich people by now. But this was a steal of the deal and expanded the nation's territory to a massive degree. Until this point, the United States had been constricted to east of the Mississippi River. After this, the United States went beyond the Mississippi. It had controlled the Mississippi River entirely and moved, and its borders are now at the Rocky Mountains. Now, some members of Jefferson's own party kind of criticized his decision to buy the Louisiana Purchase because it kind of went against the Democratic-Republican Party's little beliefs. As we mentioned, they believed that if it was not specifically stated in the Constitution that the government could do a certain thing, then the government did not have that power, and that power was automatically reserved for the states to do. Well, the Constitution, nowhere in the Constitution, nowhere in Article 2 where it talks about the presidency, or nowhere in Article 1 where it talks about Congress, does it state who really has the power to buy land. It really doesn't say nothing about that. That concept and idea was left up to interpretation. Well, Jefferson looked at it, and in this opportunity, he kind of broke his own rule. He kind of said that if I don't take the deal now, we may not get an offer this good again. And it is somewhat of a national security issue because I don't need France launching an army across the Mississippi and invading us. So in this one instance, Jefferson kind of went against his own ideals and kind of went ahead and said, you know what, just this once I'm going to break my own ideals. Even though I know I should assume that states have this power, I'm going to go ahead and say I can do it because the Constitution says nothing about it. So I'm going to assume the responsibility. And that tradition has largely stayed put to this day. Presidents commonly have the power to buy land for the nation, as we've seen in 1867 when, under Andrew Johnson's administration, Secretary of State William Seward bought Alaska territory from Russia, which, of course, at the time, everyone just thought it was a frozen wasteland. They call it Seward's Folly until they found the gold there. And then, of course, we had the factor of, in 1898, we purchased the Philippines and that from Spain for about $20 million under William McKinley. And in, I think, 1917, we purchased the U.S. Virgin Islands from Denmark. And then as recently as just about, I think, last year, President Trump actually made an offer to Denmark to actually buy Greenland, which, of course, Denmark declined. But the president has traditionally, up till now, had the power to buy land for the nation. But Jefferson, by doing so, kind of went against his own ideals. Now, and it also went against his ideals because in order to govern such a vast territory, you were going to need some governmental intervention in that area. And that's kind of also went against Jefferson's ideals, but he did it anyway. Following the purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, Jefferson sent out the explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark with their Corps of Discovery to map out and explore the new territory lands that they had gained under the purchase. And they set out in, I think, 1804 and did not return until 1806. They went all the way to the Pacific Ocean, actually. And they met quite a few Native American tribes, including the Shoshone and the Chinook, the Sioux, And they also had Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman who helped them kind of act as their navigator and guide through the area up to the Pacific. They explored the Missouri River and the Columbia River, got to the Pacific Ocean in the Pacific Northwest, and then came back. And the expedition, upon returning, was able to provide all kinds of information to Jefferson about the new plants that they had seen there, and actually some of the plants and animals they did bring back, such as prairie dogs. They did not know about prairie dogs. They were able to bring back plants and animals, geographical maps that they had kind of mapped out as they went out there, and even told them about the Native American tribes that they had met along the way, of the Native Americans that lived in the area. Now, Jefferson again ran for office in 1804, and he defeated the Federalist candidate Charles Pinckney in the 1804 presidential election by a landslide. Jefferson won by almost no competition for his second term when he ran for re-election. The total electoral college votes in the 1804 election, look here, you had a total of 176 votes. You need a majority of 88 to win. Jefferson won 162 out of 176. Yes, he won by a lot. And Pinckney won 14. Very few. The Federalist Party, I'm going to say this very slowly, at this point they're starting to decline in federal politics, and we're going to cover that up to the fifth president, their decline in politics, and eventually they go extinct. Jefferson also received the winning in the popular vote, but he received over 70% of the popular vote upon being reelected in 1804. And that was also the year, 1804 to 1805, he also was able to take credit for officially ending the threat of the Barbary pirates in North Africa, who were constantly attacking American merchant ships kind of going in the Mediterranean. He was officially able to kind of send the Marines in and the Navy to kind of squash them out, and he officially kind of got a treaty signed and ended their threat in the Mediterranean. So Jefferson can take credit for that too. However, after Jefferson got reelected, and before we really go on here, let's first, I guess, look over the three photos we're going to have here. First, we'll show you the Louisiana Purchase. We have a map of the United States and Canada and Mexico, and the area in white is what was included in the Louisiana Purchase. Until then, the United States was restricted to any part of the United States that was east of the Mississippi, so over here. This was all part of the United States. However, now we have this. All this white area gets added. We even had a little bit of Canada in here. But Lewis and Clark would go out from Missouri, right here, and they would go up all the way to the Pacific and back. They actually followed the Missouri River, so they actually went to North Dakota, I remember, and then came through. But the white area got added. That was the steal of a deal. And of course, we got the vital port of New Orleans, which controls the Mississippi River's mouth. So that was also very important. And here we have a electoral map of the 1804 election, kind of showing you how Jefferson won his landslide. Of course, by that time, right here is now the territories of the United States. Also, you can see they've expanded for the Louisiana Purchase. We can see we got one new state. We got Ohio in there now in 1804. But we can see that Jefferson won every state except for Delaware and Connecticut, which were still Federalist strongholds. Then here we also have a small painting of Lewis and Clark meeting the Chinook Indians on the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest during their expedition. This is a painting of that moment. So, as we get back on here, after Jefferson's re-election, it kind of doesn't all go that well for Jefferson. I mean, largely overall, his second term was less successful than his first, which, if we're talking blankly, not blankly, but frankly here, Most presidents, their second term is usually not as good as their first. Most presidents. Now, there have been exceptions, but in most cases, the second term is never as good as the first term. And this was very true of Jefferson as well. His second term was very much dominated by foreign politics, by foreign affairs. By 1805, Britain and France were once again at war, as now Napoleon got that money. He's now initiated his war against Britain, and at this point, the Napoleonic Wars are fully raging on in Europe. Jefferson tries to maintain a neutrality stance in the war. He didn't want the United States to take either side, but he wanted it to be able to trade with both sides in merchant trading for its economy. Of course, Britain and France are all too concerned with hurting the other economically, and even though the Americans have declared neutrality, they don't really abide by it. So they begin to harass American ships anyway. They stop them. They're seizing them. In the British case, they're actually stopping and taking American sailors off and impressing them, forcing them to join the British Navy in order to gain men, claiming that they were British deserters, which we're going to see here at the next president. That's going to lead to a major war. And it eventually just kind of gets out of hand. In some cases, they were sinking ships. And, of course, this outrages a lot of American merchants. It starts outraging Jefferson as well, because he's declared neutrality. We're supposed to be a neutral nation. We have neutral rights. And Britain and France are just kind of ignoring this. And so in 1807, Jefferson signs the Embargo Act, which bans all economic trade with Britain and France out of American ports. He bans any trade with these two nations. And Jefferson's hope is that this will hurt Britain and France economically and that they will be forced kind of back to the negotiating table. However, he very much overestimated the impact of the embargo, because any common sense person at that time would have realized the U.S. is still pretty young. Its economy is very weak compared to that of the European nations. And really, any embargo that the U.S. might place on those nations isn't really going to have much of an impact. And this is very much what happens, and it actually backfires. Instead of hurting the European nations, it actually greatly damages the U.S. economy. And this act gains a lot of unpopularity during its term. Eventually, in 1809, just before Jefferson leaves office, it is eventually repealed. That was his backfire. The only really good thing that Jefferson was able to accomplish in his second term was in 1807 he did sign a bill that banned the importation of African slaves into the United States. There was no more slave importation in the United States. The Constitution allowed that this could happen, and this could not happen until the year 1808. So although the bill was passed in 1807, it did not go into effect until January 1st of 1808. The Constitution specifically stated that they would allow importation of slaves for roughly about 30 years, 20 to 30 years, and then after that, if Congress decided to ban the importation, they could. And as soon as that deadline came up, Congress and Jefferson both took it as a necessity that they would ban the importation of slaves. So at this point, the slave trade is now being cut off in the United States. However, the internal slave trade, the selling of slaves from state to state, is not stopped, and that is what drives the continuance of slavery in the South. They're no longer getting slaves from other countries, other continents, but they've got enough in the South that they're able to kind of establish their own internal slave trade. So in 1809, Jefferson has completed 2 terms in office, and he does not run for a third term, as he obeys George Washington's little precedent that he had set. And in 1809, Jefferson leaves office in March. He retires to his home at Monticello in Virginia, and he continues his interest there, including his constant updates and architectural designs to his home and playing his violin. After the Library of Congress was actually lost during the War of 1812, which we'll be covering in our next presidential video when that comes about, which at this point I'm saying might not be till after Christmas. I think we might take a break next week since it's the holidays. But anyway, actually, we might do the Louisiana Purchase in detail if we really didn't cover it here. But I'll have to really look at that. But I would say we're not going to have a video next week. We're going to take a break for the holidays. Then we'll be back on the week after Christmas. So anyway, Jefferson, after the Library of Congress is burned when the British burned Washington, D.C. in 1814, Congress also loses its own library, its collection of volumes and books and articles and stuff like that it had kind of be keeping in record. And in order to help Congress kind of rebuild, Jefferson personally sells them his personal 6,700 personal book volume library to Congress. Out of his own, yes, Jefferson had over almost 7,000 books in his own home that he just went ahead, sold to Congress, and said, "Here, have them. Go ahead and there's your new foundation for a new library," even though he was an ex-president. In his later years, Jefferson was increasingly in debt, however, and as we mentioned, he struggled with the issue of continuing to have slaves, even though he preached that all men were created equal and that each and every person should be treated fairly and equally and had a right to freedom. Jefferson very much knew about this little decision, this little dilemma in his life. He knew about it very well. It was constantly on his consciousness and on his mind, and it troubled him very much at times. Now, we all know he eventually had children with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. There has been genetic testing done in modern days to actually confirm that. So we know that was very much something that he did. I do apologize for this small pause. Anyway, as we were mentioning, the issue of slavery did continuously weigh on Jefferson's mind. It did very much weigh on his consciousness. He was very much aware of it. And many times in his life, he pondered over the idea of how he could exactly free his slaves, but when he was so much in debt, he really couldn't afford to. It wasn't really ideological for him to do so at the time. Thus, he didn't choose to do it, although I think he still should have. But it weighed on Jefferson's mind heavily through his later years. During his later years in life, he also reconciled with John Adams starting in about 1812. They wrote over, I think, 150 letters to each other throughout the rest of their lives that basically eliminated the old hostility they had between each other and reestablished the old continual working friendship they had had together as they discussed multiple topics in the legacy of the Revolution. In 1825, when the University of Virginia opened, Jefferson was actually a founding member of the University of Virginia, and he saw it as a chance to kind of implement his statute of religious freedom on a college campus and as an academic village for which people could come and learn their educational professions. And he was very much a founder of the University of Virginia, which embodied his ideals and still does to this day largely. Unfortunately, Thomas Jefferson very sadly died on a very sad date. He died on July 4th, 1826, at the age of 83. He died in his home. He died in his bed at about noon. He died that day, and he was subsequently buried there at Monticello. Keep in mind that he died on July 4th, 1826. This was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And quite ironically, John Adams also died on that very same day, except he died later that day in the afternoon. And unfortunately for Adams, as we noted in our last video, well, actually in our last presidential video, Adams's last words were that Thomas Jefferson still survives. He did not know that his friend had just died earlier that day, just a couple of hours prior. It was quite ironic at the time. John Adams' son, John Quincy, was actually president at that time, and he made the comment that the factor that both his father and Thomas Jefferson had died on the same day, it was an act of divine. It was the act of God that they both got called home on that day, being that they had been good friends and colleagues, and the day had such a significance to both men, since they had both signed the Declaration and had been the drafters. Of course, Jefferson was the primary author, but John Adams had given him some advice as well. However, Jefferson was over $100,000 in debt when he died, and because of this, his mansion, his Monticello mansion, his furniture, even his slaves, and many other belongings were actually auctioned off to pay off that debt. The only slaves that ended up being freed was a handful of slaves, including Sally Hemings, which it's later been kind of discovered that the slaves that got freed were most likely Jefferson's own children that he had fathered with her. Jefferson's Monticello is today, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's actually the only building in the United States to receive that kind of distinction. And it's largely due to the different architectural work and styles that Jefferson constantly put into his mansion over his years of living there. On his grave, Thomas Jefferson's grave that stands at Monticello, if you ever go there, I recommend that you go see it. I have not seen it personally yet, but I plan, if I ever go out to Washington, D.C., I plan on going to Mount Vernon, Virginia, and to Monticello to see George Washington and Thomas Jefferson's homes. But anyway, his grave is there. And if you read his headstone, it reads this. It reads that here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Now, the odd thing about this is that Jefferson, which is not really surprising in any way, he wrote what would be on his own tombstone. He wrote this on paper and dictated that this is what he wanted on his tombstone when he died. So these are his own words that he had planned that they would put on there. And curiously enough, Jefferson picked out accomplishments in his life that he wanted on the tombstone, what he wanted to read as different accomplishments that he had done in his life. And oddly enough, he did not choose being president of the United States as one of these accomplishments. He viewed his other accomplishments as far more greater and important than when he had served as the third president of the United States. So in Jefferson's own mind, I don't think he viewed the presidency as the greatest moment in his life. And I don't know why he didn't, because he really did do quite a few good things when he was president. He's probably one of our better presidents, I think. And right here we have a photo here of Monticello. If you do not know what it looks like, here's a color photo of it. That's where it is. That's what you'll see if you go there today. So that kind of wraps it up for today's video. That is Thomas Jefferson, our third president. Of course, you can find him on the nickel. If you got a $2 bill by chance, you can find him on that too. Definitely one of our better presidents. He kind of started a lot of more of the modern traditions. And fun factor, I think it was Thomas Jefferson. Yes, I believe it was. It was him. He was actually the first president to eat ice cream in the White House. He's actually probably one of the first people to bring ice cream to the United States. It was originally in France where he picked it up, and thus when he came home from France, he brought it over, as he ended up loving a lot of the French culture that he had kind of encountered when he was over there in Europe. So we can thank Thomas Jefferson in a way for introducing us to ice cream. But anyway, that is Thomas Jefferson. If you do need a photo of him here, here's a printed photo, but same one that we looked at earlier. This is Thomas Jefferson, our third president from 1801 to 1809, and the first Democratic Republican president. So that covers him. Now, as I mentioned, we will probably not be doing a video next week, given it is Christmas week with Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. I'm quite busy that week a little bit, so I don't even think I'd have the time to really do one. Plus, I'm sure a lot of other people are busy as well, so they don't really have the time to watch YouTube videos. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and say that we're not doing a video next week. We will be back the week after Christmas, the week of New Year's. So we will make sure that we come back for that and do a video that week. I don't know what that will be at this point yet, but we will see. So we will have at least one more video before the end of 2020. Not that this year has been that great anyway, because this year has relatively sucked. I will say it like that. But it has. It's been a crappy year. But anyway, that concludes for today's message. So let's go ahead here, and I guess we'll go ahead and shut off. So, as always, if you have any comments, any suggestions, any questions, be certain to put them in the comment section below. If it's a question, I'll be more than happy to answer it if I can to the best of my ability. So do not be afraid to put any of them in there if there was something that you don't quite understand. If you have any suggestions, as always, put them in there. Always willing to take any suggestion that anyone brings up. Don't think that I'm not going to take it up. If I see it, I will do it. So make sure to put any of that in there if you got any. So as always, like, subscribe, hit the comment section, whatever you want to do. Feedback is always welcome. So, as always, have a good rest of your week. And since this is our last video before Christmas, have a wonderful and happy and Merry Christmas to everyone, no matter what religion, no matter what race, no matter who you are. Merry Christmas to you, and have a wonderful Christmas holiday with your family or by yourself if you're doing that, which some people are out of safety reasons, and I understand why, and even I am to a point. So, as always, have a wonderful rest of your week. Have a happy and Merry Christmas, and we will hopefully see you all back here the week after when we finally do our next video, which at this point we don't know of yet, but we'll see what happens. So, as always, have a good rest of your week. Merry Christmas, and God bless you all.